All right, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kat, and I am DWDC's program specialist. Today, I'm joined by my colleagues Amanda and Kelsey. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather here today is the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Métis, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. These nations continue to experience ongoing colonization and displacement. Today, Toronto is covered under Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. Dying with Dignity Canada is also mindful of broken treaties that occurred across Turtle Island and recognize our responsibilities as treaty people to engage in a continuous process of truth and reconciliation with all peoples across this land. I am thrilled to welcome you today. Through our webinars, we aim to provide you with information and key takeaways, as well as create space for conversation on end-of-life topics alongside the professionals that know it best. Before I welcome today's speaker, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. So everyone on the call today is muted. However, there's going to be opportunities to submit questions. To do so, please type your questions into the question bar on the Zoom side panel, and we will read it out for you at the very end of the webinar. Please try to keep your question as concise and clear as possible. While we're going to try to get to as many audience questions as possible, unfortunately, we may not get to everyone. If you have any outstanding questions or questions that are personal in nature, please email us at the email at the bottom that you see right there at support@dyingwithdignity.ca, and we will follow up. You can also call us toll free at 1-800-495-6156. This session will be recorded. And now to introduce today's speaker. Eric Mathison. So Eric is an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto Scarborough site. He researches and writes about the ethics of assisted dying, both academically and through his newsletter, Value Judgments. Eric has also worked as a clinical ethicist in Canada and the United States, and as an ethics consultant for organizations in multiple countries. Thank you so much to our speaker for joining us today. And now I'm going to pass it on to Amanda to get us started for the interview.
Okay, thank you so much, Kat. And Eric, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Of course. All right, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. For my first question, can you share a little bit about your current work and how you became involved in the specific discussion on end-of-life rights and bodily autonomy?
Sure. So I am trained as a philosopher. That's what my PhD is in. And then from there, I went into clinical ethics. So working in hospitals and helping healthcare providers, patients, and their families navigate healthcare issues that have arisen. So I'm kind of approaching bioethics questions that come up from both of those directions. And I became interested in assisted dying and other end of life issues. During my PhD, working on bioethics questions, and then it became personally, or like a kind of particular interest of mine, working in hospitals and seeing the issues that played out from there. In working in both the U.S. and Canada, I've seen kind of different healthcare systems and the pros and cons of different systems, and so I'm always on the lookout for ethics issues and figuring out how to make things better.
Okay, thank you. Now, you mentioned that you work in bioethics. Can you explain to our audience what this field entails from a sort of layman's perspective, if you will?
Yeah, bioethics is interested in ethics issues that arise from medicine or in healthcare. So that can be, there are very kind of canonical issues such as the ethics of abortion or the ethics of assisted dying. There are other ethics issues about emerging technologies in healthcare, the ethics of AI or gene editing, as well as uh, issues that arise in healthcare settings between patients and healthcare providers. Questions about confidentiality or about truth telling, that those are ethics issues that are perennial. So I'm interested in, or bioethics is interested in looking at those issues, trying to sort out what the right thing to do is.
Okay. All right. So before I move on, I did want to touch on your blog called Value Judgments. And one of the most frequent areas that you write about is medical assistance in dying, or MAID. Why do you feel so passionate about speaking about this topic on your blog?
It's partly that it connects to broader issues that I'm interested in and care about. So I think that the rise and progress of patient-centered care or person-centered care is really kind of a bioethics success story of the 20th century. If you go back to the start of the 20th century, it was really just doctors making decisions for patients without the patient's consent or without even informing them about what was going on. And the across the 20th century was just giving the recognition of patient rights, the recognition that people should be allowed to decide for themselves what kinds of healthcare treatment they're going to have, or that they're not going to have if they want to refuse treatment. So MAID, I think, is kind of situated in that context, thinking about patient autonomy. And then another issue, a thing that kind of comes up a lot with MAID is that I think MAID is a good lens to look at lots of different issues that come up. So MAID, the ethics around it, it's not just one single thing. It's lots of different stuff about access, about who gets to decide these important questions about what happens to people, as well as other ethics issues that I'm interested in from an academic point of view, questions about coercion or questions about undue influence or how the options that are available to people can shape their decision making. So all of these things kind of make me like well situated to look at or to that happens that I have a lot to say about it because it's in the news so much, it's changing all the time, and that makes it different from other bioethics issues that I care about, but that just aren't as like publicly relevant.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So this session is called Setting the Record Straight on MAID. So let's go ahead then and set the record straight
Okay.
on MAID. So let's talk a little bit first about Track 2 MAID and the Ontario Coroner's Report. So I'll start off first with asking, over the past 2 years, we've seen publications share concerning statements in the media about Track 2 MAID. Can you share first a little bit about what Track 2 MAID specifically means? And then perhaps provide some context on what types of misinformation is out there specifically about Track 2 MAID.
Sure. Just for context, when the first law was passed in Canada that legalized assisted dying, the bill was called C-14, and that had added something from the Supreme Court decision, and the addition was a requirement that a person's death, their natural death, be reasonably foreseeable. So this kind of the catchphrase that death had to be reasonably foreseeable. And that was the law for a while, and then it was eventually challenged in a Quebec decision called Truchon by two people who had longstanding disabilities, Nicole Gladue and Jean Truchon. And so they were people with disabilities who argued that they had grievous and irremediable medical conditions, so they otherwise met the criteria for MAID, but their deaths were not reasonably foreseeable. They were both going to live for, possibly for many years. So they argued that it was unconstitutional, that it was a form of discrimination, that they should be kind of made to continue to exist suffering intolerably, while other people who had a more, I guess, closer proximal natural death, why they would have access to it. So they ended up winning that decision. So the law was changed. So now in Canada, there's not a restriction. You can qualify for MAID if you have a medical condition that is serious, it causes intolerable suffering. But now there are these two tracks. So track one refers to people whose natural deaths are reasonably foreseeable. And track two refers to people whose deaths are not reasonably foreseeable. There are some additional safeguards with track two. For instance, there's a 90-day waiting period that doesn't apply for track one, as well as some other things. But that's the kind of the biggest difference.
Okay, thank you so much. And then the second part to my question, can you provide some context into what types of misinformation is out there, specifically about Track 2 MAID?
Yeah, I think that there are a few different categories or ways that this comes up. One of them is that you don't have to go back very far, to 2021 is I think the first, there was a half year where track two was permissible. At that point, like when that started, following the Truchon decision, there were many people who were saying that this was really going to lead to a huge increase in the number of MAID deaths. That it was really, that removing that condition was going to mean that all of a sudden that like lots more people were going to qualify, and that turns out to be false, and people still kind of repeat this that track two has like really opened the doors to MAID. It has definitely expanded MAID from where it was before, but the number term, in numbers, it hasn't really borne out that there's been this huge increase. So the newest data that we have for Canada, that track two provisions make up, it's under 5%. I think it's around 4% of the total of number of provisions. In Ontario, from the data that we got from last year, so the 2023 or the data about the 2023 Ontario year, that it showed that there was actually a slight decline in the number of track two deaths. So it's still making up a very small percentage. In Canada, the number is something around it was 600 track two deaths last year. So the increase from the previous year is only about another 150 people. So that's one thing, is just about the raw numbers. I think like looking at more at kind of misinformation, there are two really that I see the most often. One of them is about claims about marginalization, that there's a worry and a frequent claim that the people who are accessing Track 2 MAID are doing so because of poverty or because of other forms of marginalization. And this is an important claim to take seriously, and we should look at the data for it. But the evidence shows actually that it's a myth, that there is really just not evidence that bears out the claim that people are accessing MAID as on a consistent basis, or at all because of poverty. In fact, so again, the latest Canadian data that we have that came out just at the end of last year, it shows that it's about in the mid 50s, around 50% of Track 2 cases are people who have a neurological condition. And we know that comparing that to the Ontario data, so we got to kind of like combine different sources to kind of piece this out. That actually, that among people with Parkinson's and other neurological conditions, that marginalization is actually, or the people accessing MAID for Track 2 actually tend to be less marginalized than people who have those conditions in general. So the marginalization worries are just not really borne out by the data. And then the final one is that there are concerns that Track 2 MAID is biased against women. Overall, the Canadian numbers have been consistent for Track 1, that slightly more men access it or slightly more men have MAID than women do, but it's like 51 to 49%. But that's slightly different for Track 2. It's in the upper 50s, like 59% of women use Track 2 or make up Track 2 deaths versus Track 1. And so this has led to some concerns that there's some kind of issue going on, either that it's gender discrimination, or even people make even stronger claims that it's like a type of eugenics or kind of active discrimination. This as well is not borne out by the data. So I think what's going on is that people are they're in looking at these stats and then making false inferences, and missing that because we're talking about such a small number of people, that it doesn't take a big change to actually lead to like quite a difference in the percentage. So I like quickly ran the numbers before this. So there were 622 Track 2 deaths in last year, 2024. Sorry, in 2023. That's the data that we have. For 622, the like parity, the even point would be 311, but there were 364 women. That makes up is an extra 53 women in all of track two deaths across Canada. So that is just not enough to make any kind of statistical inference, especially that when we know that the types of conditions that lead to track two deaths actually just happen to be more common in women. So long-term chronic conditions like osteoporosis, dementia, rheumatoid arthritis, and so on. So those are the main ones. There's more we could talk about, but I just think that these claims just consistently you just see them all over the place, and just the data do not bear them out.
Okay, thank you. You spoke about medical assistance in dying and social supports and misinformation. So I think we'll follow that thread of topic. Some commentary on the issue of MAID and social supports is the country's struggling healthcare infrastructure, and the idea that this necessitates a pause or a halt to MAID in order to protect vulnerable persons. And so I'd like to ask, do you think Canada is striking the right balance when it comes to, the right to be considered for an assisted death versus adequate access to healthcare?
I think the first thing, this is one of those interesting arguments that I'm drawn to. I've written about it a bunch because I share the starting premise that people who make this argument have. So the claim is that there are just shortcomings in various ways of Canada, and I think that that's absolutely right. I think that affordable housing is too scarce. Housing just costs too much. I think wait times for healthcare are too long. Access to specialists, including mental health specialists. It just takes too long, and social supports for people with disabilities, and otherwise that they're inadequate. So I share that sense that there is a kind of like a broader problem here. But I think that the mistake that people who are making this argument make, or I think the nature of the mistake is that it just doesn't follow from that fact, like that there are these various problems, that banning MAID is going to make anything better. So if we imagine, okay, we like what these people might have in mind is that if we ban MAID, then that will force the government to like address these things, like finally get around to making housing more affordable. But I just don't see any reason to think that that's true. Like you could ban MAID, and I think the most likely outcome is that that wouldn't do anything to force the government to change stuff about long wait times or affordable housing. So then the result is that they're just going to be these people who are making an autonomous wish that they want to have an assisted death, and now they're being prevented from doing so. And so, I have this phrase that bans aren't better, and this is the perfect example of that. That there's just not a good connection between banning assisted dying and doing anything to help those specific people with the issues that they're facing about housing or about wait times, and all it's going to do is mean that they're going to suffer more. So I just don't. I suppose you framed it in terms of striking the balance, but I think actually just like it's not really a balance that needs to be struck. I just think it's like two separate things. We need to deal with. All of these social issues, and that just doesn't have a close enough connection to MAID where we can like address one or where they're connected in any way.
Okay, thank you. So, following again on that thread of MAID and marginalized groups, last year in 2024, several disability rights organizations and interested persons launched a charter challenge in British Columbia, arguing that Track 2 MAID has resulted in premature and unnecessary deaths. So, I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on this court challenge, and can you share a little bit of info about it?
Sure. So the first thing is that, yeah, this is a court challenge that involves two individuals and then a number of disability rights groups. And as you said, they're arguing that Track 2 in particular is unconstitutional. The first thing is that I think that this is an encouraging sign. I think that there have been so many criticisms and so much stuff where these arguments that about unconstitutionality or about injustices. And so it's a good thing. I think it's good that they're bringing this forward as a court case, so that it can be assessed. That's the like way to way to get things done, to see if there is actually kind of anything to their claims. So in that sense, they're kind of um, sticking their necks out, like, trying to do this, and we'll see what comes of it. I'm not very optimistic that they're going to win. I think that that they make a number of arguments, and I just don't think that they're very plausible. Now, I'm coming at this as an ethicist, so not as a lawyer, so not really speaking to like whether the legal arguments are particularly good, but just to walk through some of the claims that they're making. Uh, One of the like basis of their argument is that they think that C7, which that bill came about in response to the Truchon decision, so removing the reasonably foreseeable natural death requirement. They think that this has introduced a source of injustice, which is that now MAID, that this is the claim, that now MAID is between people who are disabled and people who aren't. So they have this argument that basically everyone applying for MAID has a disability. They take like a kind of capacious definition of what it is to have a disability. So if we just grant that for the sake of argument, so they're making this claim that it's that now the requirements mean that people with disabilities can access MAID, and that's an injustice because it's kind of singling out people with disabilities. But I think that like their kind of starting point is just a mistake. And you only have to look at the law or go way back to the Carter decision, which was the Supreme Court of Canada decision that struck down the general prohibition on assisted dying before. It doesn't say it, the law says that you have to have a serious illness, disease, or disability. But it does not say that having a disability is sufficient to qualify for MAID. That is, it does not say that, once you have a disability of any kind, that you're able to get MAID, that on its own would qualify you for MAID. In fact, that there are many people who have some form of disability who would not meet the other criteria. In particular, who would not meet the criterion that you have to have intolerable suffering. So there are people with disabilities of various sorts who are living lives that, judged from their own perspective, they're valuable, that they want to continue, and so those people would not qualify for MAID. So that's one of them. Is just that it's just not true that the law is making this distinction between people with disabilities and people without. That you can have a disability that meets like kind of one part of it, but then it's combined with other stuff for intolerable suffering. So another thing about that lawsuit is that they're making this claim that they use the word induced, that track 2 MAID is going to result in people with disabilities being induced into having MAID. Now, in the lawsuit itself, they don't give any evidence for this. So they don't show any data that people are being so induced. And I think, as I mentioned before about the numbers for track 2 MAID, it just isn't like leading to the inducement or a clear like spike in inducement of people who are choosing MAID. So not evidence for that point. They also say that they're making this claim that death should not be a solution for people with disabilities who experience intolerable suffering. So this is a common claim that we hear from people making this kind of disability rights argument, that offering death to people with disabilities is a type of injustice. Now, they don't explain that argument in the suit. They're just kind of offering it. But I think that as well is just implausible. That to say that that every single person who has a disability, that there is never grounds for requesting MAID based on that disability, that I think that's a mistake. It's in conflict with what Truchon and Gladue, the two people who argued the Quebec case that led to Truchon, to the decision, that those were people with disabilities who were arguing that their disabilities that they had for for their entire lives, and that it was causing them intolerable suffering, and that they wanted MAID. So I think in all of these ways, this suit is continuing to perpetuate this myth that disabled people are unable to make their own decisions, that they need protection from themselves, that the system is going to kind of force them into doing things that they don't want to do. And we need to be, careful about protecting people and protecting vulnerable people. But having a disability does not on its own mean that a person is vulnerable to the point where they can't make their own decisions. So my prediction is that it's not going to succeed, but we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that comprehensive layout of the facts. Before we move on to our next topic, I am curious, the whole sort of thread of this conversation is about misinformation and the impact that it can have. And so I wonder if you have any tips or takeaways for somebody that maybe has sort of that basic layman's understanding of MAID, but see something really concerning in the media about Track 2 or about MAID in general. What sources of information could they go to, or where could they start to try and understand a bit more about this claim and whether or not it holds water?
Yeah, I think the first thing is that by far the media wants anecdotes. They want stories about people, individual stories, and those are the ones that have made that have gotten the most attention, both in Canada and then when they get picked up internationally, it's around certain stories. One of the things that I saw working as a clinical ethicist is that when the media writes about a story, there's an asymmetry in the information that the media, the reporter, and that eventually the public have access to. Because typically what happens is that, in most of these stories, it's a family member who, if the person has died, it's a family member talking about that person, and so they're making claims and saying things. But the healthcare providers, the people who did the MAID provision or who are otherwise involved in that patient's care, they're not able to talk to the media about it because of privacy rules. And so these stories tend to be one-sided. We only hear from one from the family member who the concerns might be legitimate, but most of the time we're just not going to be able to like accurately assess the full to get the full picture of it. So that's a first one is just those are the most common. We hear about those a lot. Those raise concerns, but we have to approach them with caution and see how much evidence like what do we actually know about these situations. Another one is like claims about the stats. Part of the name. My newsletter is called Value Judgments, and that reflects that a lot of the stuff that we see um, in in bioethics or in kind of public ethics discussions are making inferences or like ethical judgments or value judgments about a something that is like debatable. So I think the MAID numbers are a good example. Actually, the Canadian data, like the last set that we got, that there's still been an increase, but the increase has been about halved from what it was in previous years. So it was going up for a few years. The number of MAID deaths was going up by about 30% each year. So quite a lot of growth. This last round, it's only gone up about 15%. So maybe that shows that it's plateauing, or maybe this is just a blip. But there are so many articles every year. The new data comes out and people say, "Oh, look at these numbers are so bad," and the suggestion is that there's something like sinister or untoward going on about that we can like infer from just the numbers themselves. And that's not true. Like the numbers are the numbers, and whether those numbers are good or bad is in large part going to depend on like what you think about MAID. So if you're against MAID, you're going to think that many people choosing MAID is bad. But if you're on the fence about MAID, or even if you support MAID, that like we just can't infer anything about it. Maybe it's just It's just people kind of making choices, which I think is what's going on. So I think that there are good news articles about there out there. There's good coverage, but being careful. So this is a big motivation for me writing my newsletter. I think that Dying with Dignity and there's another Substack called MAID in Canada, MAID, that has been writing a lot of stuff looking at kind of correcting misinformation. So finding out those sources is an important way to do it.
Okay, thank you so much. So back to the topic directly of MAID, we're going to dive into MAID and mental illness. So this is like the topic about MAID and social supports or marginalized groups. This has been a topic of contention for some folks. Can we start first with just sort of unpacking the progression of MAID and mental illness, and what are some of perhaps the key items that somebody should know about MAID and mental illness, and then what should people understand about those who are opposed to it?
Yeah, so sure. Just first the legislative history. So when MAID first became legal with Bill C-14, because of the requirement that death had to be reasonably foreseeable, that just kind of on its own excluded mental illness. Mental illness, even if it's grievous and irremediable, causes intolerable suffering. It's not usually something that leads to natural death. So mental illness was already kind of excluded from that. But with the Truchon decision and then with C7 that followed that up, the legislators foresaw that removing the requirement that death be reasonably foreseeable, that would open up the possibility, or that would open up MAID to people with mental illness. So there was a restriction, and this has now been postponed a number of times. So it was originally going to, it was like delayed for a year, and then it was delayed for another period, and then last year or the year before, it's now been delayed until 2027. Um, the argument for that has been that the provinces and some healthcare providers have argued that they're not ready to do these kinds of assessments. So the the ethical argument for allowing MAID for mental illness is that mental illnesses can be serious, they can be incurable, they can cause a tremendous amount of suffering, and so to exclude a people on the grounds of like such a large category as mental illness is unjustified. So we shouldn't make a distinction between mental or between any type of illness, like whether the if you have an illness or a disease or a disability, regardless of what's causing that, you should be able to qualify if you meet the criteria. So that's the basics of it that I think that ethically there's not really a good justification. I think that there are appropriate concerns about what is this going to look like in practice? How do we do the assessments and so on? But I think that those are things that have been addressed and that we shouldn't keep postponing MAID for mental illness because some people don't feel ready. Other healthcare providers do feel ready. They say that they're capable of doing these assessments and that they can kind of work through the nuances. And that overall, we also know from other jurisdictions like the Netherlands that the number of people who would meet the criteria is very small, like way smaller than track two deaths. So it's not talking, once again, these concerns that it's going to be like an avalanche of mental illness requests that's unlikely to be the case.
Yeah, thank you. Just building on what you had mentioned about, sort of an avalanche of requests building, I wonder if you can speak to the piece about the irremediability of a mental illness. There are some groups that purport that irremediability is simply not a factor in mental illnesses, the way it can be factored in with physical conditions, and that ultimately by expanding MAID and mental illness, we are essentially cutting off necessary supports, medications, treatments that could go to folks that otherwise could still live. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it is true that establishing irremediability is different and in some cases is more complex. But we also now have, there's just lots of evidence, both from the psychiatry and psychology literature, as well as stories of like people who have been reported in the news who have been dealing with a condition, a mental illness for decades, and so the where exactly like exactly at the point where we establish irremediability that there is a gray there's a line there. But to say that nobody, no one with mental illness, it can ever be established that they will be irremediable, I just don't think is borne out. So I think there are kind of um, two separate kind of like m misunderstandings. One is about the decision-making capacity. So whether people with mental illness are able to make their own decisions, is it possible for them to give informed consent to MAID? And that there's a common belief among the general public that if you have a mental illness such as depression or anorexia or something, that you're not going to be able to give consent. That's actually not true. There are lots of studies where they have psychiatrists, experts in establishing decision-making capacity, do capacity assessments of people, including people who are inpatients in psychiatric facilities, and find that the number of those people who have capacity is like is non-trivial. Can be upwards of, in some cases, like 75% of them understand what they're doing, like appreciate the consequences of their decisions, and so on. So that is, I think, a myth. And then the other one is this belief that the mental illness is always going to be treatable. There's like also lots of studies about this, that treatment resistance it varies depending on the mental illness that we're talking about. Um, but the response rate for treatment for all mental illnesses is, like kind of caps out at about 50%. So there's, just, like lots of evidence from that, any psychiatrist can attest to this, that people can go through every treatment modality, they can try everything that's available, and they still just might not get better. And some mental illnesses are better than others or more treatable than others, but others are particularly pernicious. So anorexia nervosa is a good example of that. That there are just many people who go through those programs, and don't get better, and so they end up in this cycle of being involuntarily committed. They get treatment forced on them. They recover enough, and then they get sick again, lose weight, and then go through the cycle.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. That concludes the interview portion of our session today. So we're going to go ahead now and move it on to the audience Q&A. So thank you so much, audience members, for submitting your questions, both in the registration and live during the session. So let's take a look and go ahead and get started. So this audience member is asking about, can you speak to the ethical considerations that doctors should follow or keep in mind when someone is making a MAID request to them, regardless of whether or not that individual is a MAID clinician or not?
Sorry, so the question is about which sorts of things that the assessors should keep in mind?
So that their healthcare provider should consider, regardless of whether or not they're a MAID clinician or not. So, for example, if it was a family doctor who's sort of getting that first indication that a patient wants to request MAID and get the process started, what might be some of the ethical considerations that that family doctor should keep in mind?
Oh, so for family doctors, they're well placed to, they know the patient, and in many cases have known the person for a long time, so they can kind of situate it in the person's the context of what their disease is and the trajectory of it. So I think that first is just, is this kind of in keeping with what they know about the patient, and does it kind of make sense for them? Is like would they meet the basic criteria in order to go forward with an assessment? Getting assessed does not mean that they're going to qualify for MAID. So giving them the information that they want, and explaining, connecting them with resources for how to go forward of that, or if the doctor can do it themselves, then to explain that process.
Okay, thank you. And thanks to the audience members for submitting that question. Let's move on to the next one. This person's curious about what are some of the circumstances in which an ethicist might be helpful? For example, if somebody is sort of receiving end-of-life care in hospital, and they have, a substitute decision maker, other family members around them, when might be the situation that somebody like an ethicist would be called in to support?
So The ones that we get, most of the consults that we get involve substitute decision makers. When you have a person who's unable to give consent for themselves, that just makes it more complex. The sorts of ways that we can be helpful, if sometimes the family member or the substitute decision maker is just unsure what the right thing to do is. So they're just trying to puzzle through, trying to make sense of what they know about the patient and know about their values. Sometimes there's a disagreement between the doctor and the substitute decision maker about what is or there's they're not sure about kind of the best way forward. So helping navigate as kind of like a process point, helping navigate through that are some of the ways.
Okay, thank you so much, and thanks, audience member. Next question. Can you speak to marginalization, specifically in the sense of somebody who is living in poverty, again, limited access to social welfare resources, and the supports that people living with a non-reasonably foreseeable natural death might have, or if they're experiencing a disability. So again, talking about that marginalization piece, about somebody who doesn't have access to a lot of those resources, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so as part of the process for qualifying for MAID, you, the patient, the applicant, have to be told about other options that are available to you. So if you're not in palliative care, that can include palliative care, and that would also include other social supports. And what we see in MAID cases is that there are uh, uh, you know, supports available to figure out what the social supports are. So, that might involving a social worker, involving specialists, and so on. Um, so, so, um, so being provided with that is an important part of it. But after that, I think that there's the fact that somebody is experiencing poverty does not mean that they're choosing MAID because of their poverty. And so even if the data showed that people who were requesting MAID tended to be more marginalized in that way, that's not true. But even if it did, that on its own would not show that it was poverty that was driving it. It might be that there are other kind of connections to that. And we know from track two, just because of the nature of those conditions, that people who would qualify for track two, that they're less likely to be able to work, for instance. And so on marginalization indices, they would score higher on marginalization because they're not able to work. So we have to be careful about like what are the actual uh, separating, like what are the things we know about the case from like what's actually causally doing a role here.
Yeah, absolutely. As a follow-up question, Eric, it seems to be that, the thread of the concern about MAID and marginalized groups or MAID and mental illness is again that concern about coercion, whether that's an external pressure from social, financial, economic pressures, or, an internal one, whether it comes from a family member or from a healthcare provider. I think there's that under thread of concern about coercion. I wonder if you could share a little bit then about, how does coercion factor into MAID? What are the protections that exist for somebody applying for MAID to avoid that threat of coercion?
So, as part of the assessment process, like a key thing that the MAID assessor is looking at is what reasons the person has for applying, and if there's any evidence that their decision is not authentically their own. So that could be from family pressure, or that could be from other pressure, other kind of coercion in some way. And MAID providers are trained to look for that. So it's not to say that there's n never any kind of doubts or any concerns about it, but it's one of the key things that they're looking at. So I think that the way that these arguments come up the most often is that the presence of kind of structural features like poverty or lack of housing or something, that if there's evidence of that, then the decision that the person's making is not authentic. And as I said before, with about housing, that we could like we do want to address those things, but a ban would not actually improve it, and people can still make choices that are authentic, kind of even if they're constrained by what their situation is. So one of the analogies that I consider is to abortion, that the polling shows that for younger women who get an abortion, one of the key factors that they're worried about is like supporting the child, like whether they'll be able to afford it, if they can take time out of school or their work or so on. And if we think that in those cases that like their concerns about factors other than the medical condition specifically, that that's playing a role. If we think that that should lead to a ban for abortion, I just think that that would be like totally unjustified. Like part of autonomy in healthcare is people can make decisions about like their situation. It doesn't have to be about the medical condition specifically. It's making a decision in the context of one's life about what somebody is prioritizing or about what they care about the most, given the facts of the situation that they're in. So the same thing is true of MAID. I think that there's a serious risk that people who are making those coercion arguments are overplaying their hand. It's just going to lead to like people are not going to be able to make any kinds of choices in healthcare if there's and that's once again like taking away their autonomy and saying like because you're just too poor to be able to make your own choices, and that's like a terrible result. So I think that they uh, uh, you know, we need to like think through what would it actually imply. And just like as an aside, now that you got me going on this, that we could address this issue if we wanted to by saying, okay, there's just an income threshold, and if you make less than X amount of money a year, or if you don't have this much in your bank account, then you can't qualify for MAID. And that would solve the problem, as the problem that they see that poverty is driving this. Nobody's proposing that because they see the very obvious point that it would be terribly unjust to say, like, I'm sorry, you're just too poor to get MAID. Only wealthier people can get MAID. But that would address the problem. So banning, like focusing on track two or focusing on these other things, it's just totally a red herring. If they really care about like stopping MAID because of poverty, then just ban MAID because when poverty is involved. But that's a really bad result. So I think no matter how you square it, these concerns are just that it's like again, justified concerns, poverty is a concern, lack of affordable housing is a concern. But anything where this like comes into to play with MAID is not going to be an ethical result.
Okay. Thank you, audience member. Next question. This audience member asks, can you speak to the relationship between access to social supports or palliative care, and then, contrasting that with access to MAID? I think we've also seen concerns in the media before that MAID is somewhat of a shortcut from palliative care, or that palliative care is not offered if an individual is going to choose MAID. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. Yeah, this is a concern that comes up in every jurisdiction that's considering MAID. There are worries that there's this choice between, that MAID is going to save money or that it's kind of replacing palliative care. But in fact, that is not true. That's not true in Canada and the UK, which is going through its kind of deliberations about legalizing assisted dying right now. This is coming up. Access to palliative care has increased since Canada legalized MAID, and the vast majority of people who end up getting MAID are already in palliative care. I forget what the exact numbers are, but it's in the 80% for sure. So I don't think it's an either or thing. I think that most of the people who are getting MAID are choosing it because of palliative care, and because of the stats, like they ask people in Canada, like what their reasons are for getting MAID, as well as in Oregon and other places. And the main things that come up are loss of autonomy, loss of the ability to engage in meaningful activity. And these are the sorts of things that palliative care is just less good at addressing. So even with the best palliative care, they will be able to treat pain or treat other kind of other symptoms. But palliative care, even when it's doing its best, cannot address all of these things. So there's not a trade-off. I think that palliative care is incredibly important, but it's not an either-or thing.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay, audience member questions. Keep them coming in, everyone. Thank you so much for your time. So this audience member is curious about MAID and mental illness. So given the previous delays or the extensions, if you will, that now have extended to March 17th of 2027, this audience member is curious about your perspective on whether or not MAID and mental illness might continue to be pushed back, or even disbarred altogether.
Yes, I think that it will. partly depend on kind of broader political trends, and whether whichever government is in power then will what they will choose to do. But there are now, because of the delays, there's a lawsuit going on in Ontario challenging the delay. I think that there's, we've already seen that, with the current governments, that are otherwise have been supportive of MAID, that hasn't been something that they've wanted to take on, so they've been kind of pushing it back. So if there's a different government, then it might be even more likely that it'll get pushed back. However, all of the main changes that we've had in Canada for MAID have come about from legal challenges. So this is another way that a legal challenge could end up kind of forcing the government's hand.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. Next question. This audience member asks, how are disagreements, if you happen to know, how are disagreements between MAID assessors resolved? So, for example, one individual is found eligible by one assessor, and the other assessor finds them not eligible for MAID.
I don't think I'm the person to address this. So there is a third person, and then people can also, can get other assessments, but I don't know enough about it to really explain it in detail.
Okay. Thank you, audience member. I'm curious a little bit about going back to access to MAID and access to palliative care. And I'm curious if you have any data or reflection on that, that indicates that access has continued to improve, or if, palliative care, I think at times it can be a bit of palliative care versus MAID. I'm curious if you have any perspective on what palliative care and palliative teams have when they think of MAID, and sort of vice versa with MAID clinicians and palliative care teams. Do you see that relationship as being congruous or conflicting?
Yeah, historically, palliative care, there's been a tension that they have not been, as a group, supportive of MAID, and have, the kind of, like governing bodies of palliative care have come out against it. That is softening a little bit, which is kind of follows a trend that we see in jurisdictions, that, among physicians generally in Canada, for instance, that prior to MAID's legalization, there was a lot more skepticism and a lot more opposition. And then once it came out, physicians were kind of cautiously, kind of paying attention, looking at it, and now support is increasing. There's a wide range of perspectives in palliative care, but some palliative care physicians still see that they're just in conflict, that you shouldn't provide MAID and provide palliative care. But that's certainly not true of all palliative care doctors, and I think that that's, in general, maybe slowly a trend that is turning around.
All right. Thank you so much. Next question here. What are your thoughts on, or your perspective, let's say, about accessing medical assistance in dying through an advance request for MAID?
Yeah, so just for context, so in Canada, in the criminal code, the federal criminal code, requires the individual to give consent at the time of the provision. So you have to have capacity, you have to be able to give consent and actually give consent, at the time of the provision. There's like a very kind of like small carve out for people who are at risk of losing capacity, very soon. But generally that's the requirement. Quebec last year in October began offering advance requests for MAID. So one of the main things that people worry about, the reason that they want MAID, is because of concerns like dementia. So when MAID first became legalized, the hospital I was working at, or as I spoke to people about it, one of the most common things I heard was, "Oh, this is good because my mother had, dementia, and I'm worried I'm going to get dementia. So now that makes me feel comfortable." And then I would have to say, well, actually, dementia is actually, probably, it's like very unlikely that you could qualify based on dementia, because by the time that the dementia has advanced enough that it would constitute as a grievous and irremediable medical condition, you wouldn't be able to give consent. Polls show that support for some kind of process for allowing MAID in these cases, is very high. It's almost equal to support in general for MAID in Canada. Around 85% of Canadians support it. So what Quebec has done is, made a system where once an individual is diagnosed with a medical condition that will lead them to lose capacity, so something like dementia, they can make an agreement with a specific healthcare provider, a physician or a nurse practitioner, to say, once these particular criteria that I've decided are met, so maybe I'm no longer able to recognize my family, or whatever they are, then I consent to MAID, and then the physician can go ahead with MAID once that's been established and verified by another healthcare provider. So overall, I think that this is a positive trend, that we already allow advanced directives in Canada, that people can state their wishes for treatment even when they're no longer able to give consent, or no longer capable of giving consent, and that's something that we already recognize for other things, including for other end of life stuff. So you can say in your advanced directive, I don't want to be on a ventilator, or I don't want to be even given nutrition and hydration. So all other end of life things are already covered, and I think Quebec's we're watching closely, because Quebec's um, their approach is interesting, that it's not a broad advanced directive, it's a specific kind of more narrowly focused advanced request. So I think it's a positive change, and it just hasn't been going on long enough to be able to kind of really assess, to know what the pros and cons of it are. But I'm optimistic about it, and I'm watching it closely.
Okay, thank you. We've just got a few more minutes here before we wrap up, so we'll get to a few more questions. Keep them coming, everyone.
Rapid
This one,
fire.
yes, rapid fire. So, what are your thoughts on situations when family members oppose someone's request for MAID and/or try to interfere with that request? What sort of ethical principles relate to these scenarios?
I think that the concern, that family members can bring concerns, and they can have legitimate concerns, and this is not just about MAID, but about other kinds of treatment, and so there should be a process to look at those, but the ones that again get the most attention are situations where a family member who doesn't really have kind of full insight into what is going on, that they have concerns about it, from an understandable position, wanting to protect their loved one, and that can lead to kind of interference with the patient themselves, being able to access the treatment that they want, and that they qualify for. So I do think that there needs to be, the oversight is from the process already, that there are multiple assessors and so on. And I have concerns about family members getting involved, just as I do in other kinds of, in other healthcare situations, where it interferes with the autonomous decision of a person who, is able to make up their own mind. So in general, I think that it's the ones that have made the news are troubling, and proposals that families should have more oversight, or be able to kind of veto it or something. I think that those are serious cause for concern.
Yeah. I mean, just before I move to the next question, could you expand a bit on what the concern there is? A family member is only intervening, or a loved one is only intervening, presumably out of deep concern, as you mentioned, or deep care for that individual. Because that intention is well placed, or well meant, why exactly is it that it still causes concern for you when a family member or a loved one wishes to intervene, especially when, the outcome is so serious and final?
I think that the concern is that I mean, in most cases, the loved one is not able to accurately assess capacity, or not able to maybe fully understand what the patient's condition is, or what its status is. So it is, as I say, coming from a well-meaning place, but family members are just individuals who aren't trained in capacity assessments, should not be able to kind of like override the decision of somebody who's an expert in making those judgments. So as I said, there, not just for MAID, but in other cases, that family members should be able to bring concerns forward, and that there should be a process for assessing those. But for a family member to be able to say, no, I just don't think this is the right choice, and so I want to stop this, and then they go to court or something. I think that those are the troubling cases.
Absolutely. Thank you. Okay. Next question. This audience member is curious about, again, talking about conflict and perhaps reluctance towards MAID. What about religion and how it can be an obstacle in accessing MAID? Perhaps not just for the patient themselves and the spiritual or religious internal conflict they may experience while pursuing a request for MAID, but also I think the wider spiritual and religious beliefs that, their loved ones, their community, might exhort on that person. I'm wondering if you could share any thoughts about religious conflicts and choosing MAID.
Yeah, so I think it's fine for like we all just part like it's part of being a human to be relating with other people, that we can be influenced by other people and by our loved ones and by the people who are leaders for us who we choose. And so I think that sometimes people have concerns about coercion, like the patient had made up his mind and then he speaks to his wife and then he changes his mind or something. And those are something that we need to look into, but it's not always that something wrong has happened. We can, it's just families influence each other, that or family members influence each other. We know from the data from last year for the Canadian data, that there were, I think, something like 30 people who changed their mind because of the intervention of a religious leader. Now, if you're concerned about coercion, I haven't seen any of these MAID objectors raise this as a problem, but this is a case where there's like a worry that the person had made up their mind, and then the priest or whoever showed up and kind of talked them out of it, and maybe that's a concern. But I actually don't think that like on its own, maybe there's a worry there that the person was like pressured so much. But I think that that's actually that doesn't have to be. So just getting the kind of data, that doesn't show us that something wrong has happened. This is a good point to mention, though, that I do think that there are like broader structural things that in Canada that religious hospitals, faith-based hospitals, that they routinely do not allow MAID and abortion and other sorts of things that they have moral opposition to occur, and that leads to really bad outcomes that people who they need to be forcibly transferred to a different place to be able to get MAID, and that can lead to suffering and so on. So there are many, both at the individual and at the broader level, these religious issues play a role. But I think it's just like community, like people being influenced, that I don't think that on its own is a problem.
Absolutely. We're just wrapping up here, and I'm just curious now about talking about sort of the broader structural influences that impact somebody's experience or decision to choose MAID. And you touched a little bit on forced transfers, or as they're also known, institutional religious obstructions. And I'm curious, you mentioned people influence people, and that's sort of a natural aspect of life. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on faith-based institutions, for example, barring access to these healthcare treatments like abortions, like MAID, and what might be their justification for prohibiting these treatments, and what might be the argument against prohibiting those treatments on those sites.
The argument is that it's wrong and they should lose their funding if they're not going to provide all of the services that are, should be publicly available. The argument that they're making is that they, as an institution, that institutions can have a conscience. And so if it's a Catholic facility, for instance, that Catholicism is, against MAID and against other things. And so that they should be able to kind of make a choice about what they want to do. And I think that's totally fine for a private facility. But I think that the reason that we shouldn't accept that is that those places are usually given public funding. Sometimes they're the only medical option or healthcare option in a particular region. So this is true of hospitals and also true of long-term care facilities. And so for them to say, we have a monopoly on care in this region, and we're going to restrict access to various things, including MAID, because of our religious conscience. I think that the rights of individual people to access healthcare in Canada, like the full kind of suite of healthcare that's available, I think that should take priority. If a particular person, there might be justifications for individual conscientious objection as long as other healthcare providers are available to kind of fit in. But for a hospital overall to say, we're going to prevent our providers from doing these things, I don't think is ethically justified.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's all the questions we had for this afternoon. We hope you find this webinar worthwhile. Thanks to the generosity of our supporters, we can provide webinars like this and all of our other quality and compassionate services 100% free of charge to people across Canada. So we ask that you please consider paying it forward and empowering us to continue the work we do by making a donation today. So we've also got the link in the chat if anybody wishes to contribute. I just wanted to say, Eric, thank you so much for your time today. Your insights, expertise, analysis was wonderful and informative. And I know that we've received a lot of positive feedback already from our audience members in the chat. So just wanted to say thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Amanda, and thanks to all of you for watching.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so without further ado, that is the end of today's session. Now, this is the first of 4 sessions in the Myths and Facts series. Next week, we will be diving into myths and facts on MAID and marginalization in Canada. So we touched on a little bit of it today, but we're going to make it our full focus for next week. So if you haven't registered already, our newsletter as well as our website share more details about that webinar next week. So without further ado, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Eric, and have a wonderful afternoon.